A young mistress believes she owns everything now that the millionaire she seduced has been sent to prison. She walks proudly through the mansion, throwing his mother's suitcase out the front door and laughing as she declares, "Your time is over." But just as the last suitcase hits the marble floor, a voice echoes from the top of the staircase. The millionaire's pregnant wife, the woman they both once betrayed, appears, fragile but unyielding. With a single line, she makes the whole house turn against its false queen. What follows is a powerful story of betrayal, justice, and redemption that will keep you on edge until the very last moment. Tell us what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The sun at midday poured through the glass walls of Hale Manor until the marble floor shimmered like water. The house looked almost holy, as if silence itself were polished. Dust drifted in the air, catching fire in the white light. Somewhere, deep inside the walls, the old grandfather clock began its slow, metallic breathing. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and expensive loneliness. At the center of that quiet stood Clara Voss, 28, her crimson dress the only color that dared exist. The hem caught the sunlight, glowing like flame against the pale floor. In her hand, a set of silver keys jingled softly. Every sound she made was deliberate. She liked the echo. She liked the way it told her she belonged. Near the front door, Margaret Hale clutched a scuffed brown suitcase to her chest. The skin of her hands was thin as onion paper, her wrists trembling under the weight of old age and insult. She looked small inside the grand hall, a relic surrounded by glass and stone. "You shouldn't be here," Clara said. Her tone was bright, the kind of brightness that burns. "The lawyers have signed everything over. He wanted me to have it all. That makes me the lady of this house now." Margaret blinked against the light. "You mistake possession for blessing, my dear," Clara laughed. The sound cracked against the ceiling and came back louder. "Blessing? He gave me what I deserved. What's left for you is pity. You can take that suitcase and—" She swung her arm wide. "Go back to wherever women like you fade away." The words landed like stones. Margaret's lips trembled, but no reply came. Her shoulders straightened only enough to keep her dignity from falling entirely. The clock struck 12. Its chime rolled through the hall. 1, 2, 3, each note colder than the last. Clara turned toward the windows. "You hear that?" she said with a grin. "That's the sound of noon, the hour when the past officially ends." She stepped closer. The thin sunlight cut across her face, showing every flaw her vanity tried to hide. She yanked the suitcase from Margaret's arms. The movement was sudden, violent. The old woman gasped. The suitcase hit the marble with a hollow crack. The latch snapped, and its contents spilled like a wound opening. Folded sweaters tumbled out, a rosary tangled in its chain, a framed photograph of a young man in a navy suit. The glass shattered on impact. Clara exhaled sharply, almost satisfied. "Time's up, Mrs. Hale. Your reign is over." No one moved. The maids along the wall stood frozen, eyes fixed on the floor. Their silence was its own confession. A shaft of sunlight slid across the room, washing over Margaret as she knelt to collect the fallen pieces of her life. She touched the broken photograph. Her fingertips trembled on the glass until a small bead of blood appeared. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered, "My reign? Child, I never ruled anyone. I only kept the lights on when your kind turned them off." Clara tilted her head, amusement tightening her smile. "Keep your sermons. The world has changed. I have the keys. I have the deed. That makes me the truth now." The sunlight grew harsher, blinding white on her dress, on the marble, on the spilled clothes. The brightness revealed more than it forgave. One maid crossed herself silently. Another stepped backward, afraid even to breathe. Margaret tried to rise but stumbled. The suitcase lay open beside her like an accusation. She rested her palm on the cracked glass again. "You'll learn," she said softly. "Every key you hold will one day rust." "Liam!" For the first time, Clara hesitated. Her hand tightened around the keys until they pressed into her skin. The metal felt hot. She turned away from the light, but it followed her, crawling up her back like a verdict. The clock's pendulum clicked, once, twice, then stopped. Outside, a wind moved through the garden, brushing the tall windows. The curtains lifted, letting the daylight flood in deeper. The sound made Clara glance toward the staircase, a slow creak, the faint rhythm of someone stepping forward. The maids exchanged glances. Their faces changed, like people seeing an old prayer come true. From the landing above, a shadow appeared against the blaze of Sunday. At first only a silhouette, fragile yet unyielding, framed by white light. Then the details emerged. A woman in a pale blue dress, one hand on the banister, the other resting on the curve of her stomach. Her hair caught the light, her face calm but unreadable. The hall drew in a collective breath. Clara's throat went dry, the color drained from her cheeks. "No," she whispered. Margaret turned her face upward, her eyes wide, not with fear but recognition. She mouthed a name she hadn't dared to hope for. Eleanor Hale stood at the top of the stairs. The light behind her was so intense that for a moment she seemed carved from it. Her presence rearranged the air. Every shadow shifted to make room. She didn't move yet. She only looked down at the mess below, the scattered clothes, the broken glass, her mother-in-law still on her knees, and Clara frozen beside the wreckage she'd made. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, unhurried, but it filled every corner of the hall. "Pick them up. Nothing more. Just that." The words hung there, clean and unmistakable. Even the air seemed to pause, waiting to see if anyone would dare disobey. Clara stood rigid, her pulse hammering in her throat. Margaret's head bowed, not in defeat but in something like awe. The chandelier above caught the sunlight again, scattering 1,000 fragments of brightness across the floor. Each crystal flickered like a tiny eye, bearing silent witness to what had just begun. And then, as the light deepened and the stillness thickened, the world seemed to lean forward, holding its breath, because something in the house had shifted, though no one yet dared to name it. That moment, suspended between silence and response, became the reason the next moment would erupt. It was the space between humiliation and justice, the space that would open the next act. Silence held the house like a spell. The order had been spoken, yet no one dared to move. The sunlight through the tall windows burned white, tracing hard lines across the marble. Dust hung in the air, trembling, unsure whether to fall. The air itself seemed to wait for permission to breathe. Eleanor Hale stood halfway up the staircase, her hand resting lightly on the polished oak rail. Her other hand supported the curve of her stomach. The pale blue of her dress caught the light, turning her into part of the brightness itself. Below her, the hall looked like a stage after a storm. The suitcase lay open. A broken frame glinted. Pieces of a life had spilled and refused to go back into order. No one spoke. Even the ticking of the clock had stopped. The only sound came from the slow, nervous shifting of shoes against stone as the maids glanced at one another, waiting for a cue. Eleanor took the first step downward. The wood under her heel gave a faint sigh. The sunlight followed her movement, rippling along the banister as if drawn by her will. Every step was measured, the rhythm soft but commanding. Her face remained calm, though the pulse at her neck betrayed the effort it took to stay so. Clara Voss stood frozen in the middle of the hall. The red of her dress seemed to bleed into the white light until it looked bruised. Her hands clenched around the ring of keys that had once made her feel powerful. Now the metal cut into her palm. Sweat traced a path behind her ear. Eleanor reached the center of the staircase. She paused, her gaze steady, her voice even. "You," she said, "pick them up, help Mrs. Hale into the parlor, open the windows." The maids jumped at the sound of her voice. It was not loud, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that made obedience feel like safety. One by one, they moved. Their hands shook as they gathered the fallen clothes, the small rosary, the shattered frame. A maid knelt beside Margaret, whispering softly before helping her stand. The old woman leaned into the touch, her breath shallow but sure. Tears shimmered in her eyes but refused to fall. The sunlight shifted again, warmer now, gliding over their hands as they worked. It reached the cracked glass, scattering fragments of color onto the walls, small rainbows trembling against the white. Margaret lifted her chin slightly, looking toward her daughter-in-law. For the first time that day, hope crossed her tired face. Clara did not move. Her jaw tightened. The keys slipped from her grasp, landing on the marble with a sharp metallic sound. The noise startled her. She looked down at them as if seeing an animal she could no longer control. Eleanor's eyes followed the sound, then returned to Clara. She did not smile. She simply watched, her expression calm but unyielding. The stillness between them grew heavy, pressing on the air. Inside Clara, something twisted, a mixture of fury and fear that felt too much like truth. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The silence around her made her feel small, exposed, ridiculous. Her reflection in the marble floor wavered, stretched, then broke under the flood of light. Eleanor took another step downward. The hem of her dress brushed the stair, whispering. The faint scent of lavender from her sleeve carried through the hall. Her eyes moved past Clara, to the sight of Margaret being led gently toward the parlor. The image steadied her breathing. A part of her chest loosened. The maids guided Margaret across the hall, their movements cautious, almost reverent. The older woman's steps were slow, but each one seemed to reclaim a fragment of dignity that had been torn from her earlier. The rustle of her skirt against the marble was the softest sound of victory. When the parlor door closed, the light in the hall changed. It grew clearer, cleaner. The house exhaled. Eleanor remained where she was, just above the last step. She looked around the hall, the open suitcase, the ring of keys abandoned on the floor, the dust drifting through beams of light like small spirits set free. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of her body, the child within her shifting gently. Beneath the calm exterior, her mind was a quiet storm. Memories rose and fell, nights of fear, words said in anger, the echo of slammed doors. But here, in this daylight, the ghosts of those nights lost their power. Across the hall, Clara finally found her voice. It was a thin, trembling sound. "You think they'll listen to you forever?" she said, her words more question than threat. Eleanor's gaze did not change. "They listen to what's right," she replied softly. Her tone held no triumph, only fact. The sunlight caught her eyes, making them seem brighter, almost translucent. She stepped down one more stair. The small sound of her shoe meeting the wood filled the silence. Clara took half a step backward. The motion was almost imperceptible, but it broke the symmetry between them. Her breath came faster. The corners of her mouth twitched, caught between defiance and dread. The chandelier above trembled slightly, sending scattered reflections across the walls. The tiny sparks of light moved like witnesses, flickering over Clara's face, over Eleanor's shoulders, over the cracked photograph that still lay open. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The tension thickened until it was nearly physical. Every object in the room seemed aware of its place. Eleanor's fingers tightened briefly on the railing, not from fear but from control. Her voice came again, low and certain. "No one owns this house but truth." The words didn't echo. They settled, like dust finding its place after being disturbed. Clara's lips parted, yet she said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the windows, to the door, to the ceiling, anywhere but the staircase. The light was relentless. The maids had gone quiet again, gathered at the edge of the parlor. Margaret sat inside, her shadow visible through the open doorway, a still shape in a chair. The smell of air and sunlight began to replace the old perfume that had haunted the house. Eleanor let the silence stand. It was not a pause, but a verdict. Around her, the world seemed to wait for what would follow, though even she did not yet know the form it would take. She drew one last breath, steady and full. The child inside her moved, a small reminder that justice carried weight, as real as life itself. The light that filled the hall began to shift, stretching slowly toward the doorway that led to the next room. The air shimmered, alive with unspoken momentum. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the floor, where the keys still glinted. She did not pick them up. She simply watched the sunlight creep toward the parlor and knew that, soon, something else in this house would demand to be faced. The dining room of Hale Manor gleamed like a set prepared for an audience that would never arrive. Noon sunlight poured through the tall windows, stretching across the 40-foot walnut table and gliding over silver cutlery and crystal glasses. The air smelled of polished wood and red wine, a sweetness that felt deceptive. Everything had been arranged for display, not for comfort. At the head of the table sat Clara Voss, her red dress catching every reflection of light. She touched the rim of her wine glass, letting it hum with a faint vibration. The sound filled the quiet, small and sharp. Her hair was immaculate, her lipstick perfect. On her face rested a smile rehearsed in front of too many mirrors. Across from her, the door opened softly. Eleanor Hale entered without a word. Her steps were slow, steady, almost ceremonial. The pale blue of her dress looked even lighter under the sunlight, her figure outlined by the glow. She did not glance at the servants who stood motionless along the wall. She simply crossed the room and sat opposite Clara. Her hands rested neatly on her lap. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than it should. Outside, the cicadas screamed against the glass. Clara broke the silence first. "He used to sit here," she said, her voice light but trembling slightly. "Every day, right there. He said this table made him feel powerful." She gave a little laugh, brittle as glass. "Now I know what he meant." Eleanor looked at her, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were steady, the kind that listened without yielding. "Does it?" she asked quietly. Clara's smile flickered. "It does. When you've fought for everything you have, when you've survived what people said about you, it feels good to sit where power belongs." She lifted her wineglass and studied the liquid inside. "He gave me this. The house, the name, everything you see." Eleanor's gaze lowered to the glass in Clara's hand. The sunlight hit the wine, turning it almost black. "He gave you his reflection," she said, "and you mistook it for substance." Clara leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think I don't deserve it? You think I didn't earn any of this?" Eleanor didn't move. Her fingers brushed the edge of the white tablecloth, smoothing a wrinkle that wasn't there. Her tone remained calm. "I think you built your home in the shadow of another woman's pain. That never lasts." The words landed like a quiet storm. Clara blinked rapidly, trying to laugh again, but the sound faltered. "You sound like his mother," she said, bitterness creeping into her tone. "Always preaching about morality, about decency. Do you know what that ever got her? Loneliness." Eleanor looked toward the window. The sunlight divided the room into two halves, one bright, one drowned in shadow. "Loneliness isn't always a punishment," she said softly. "Sometimes it's just peace without witnesses." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The servants still hadn't dared to shift their weight. The air felt too delicate to disturb. Then Eleanor reached into the small leather folder beside her chair and drew out a sealed envelope. She placed it on the table, pushing it forward with 2 fingers. "These came this morning," she said. Clara stared at the envelope as if it might burn her. "What is that?" "The ruling from the court," Eleanor replied. "Final confirmation. Hale Group and all assets revert to the legal wife." The red drained from Clara's face. "You're lying," she whispered. Eleanor didn't answer. She only tapped the envelope gently, the sound light but decisive. The seal caught the sunlight and glimmered gold. Clara reached out slowly, her manicured fingers brushing the edge. When she pulled the papers free, the rustle of the legal pages sounded like thunder in the silence. Her eyes darted across the text, line after line, the truth written in ink. She pushed back from the table. "No," she said, voice rising. "No," he said. "He said I would have everything." Eleanor's tone didn't change. "He promised you what he could never give himself. Integrity doesn't transfer." Clara's hand shook. She grabbed her glass again, took a deep swallow of wine, and set it down too hard. The liquid rippled, dark circles widening on the white cloth. "This isn't over," she hissed. Eleanor's eyes lifted to meet hers. "It already is." The room went very still. The sound of the cicadas outside faded, replaced by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the echo of their breathing. Clara reached for her glass again, but her grip slipped. The stem broke between her fingers. The glass fell, shattering against the marble floor. Red wine splattered up the tablecloth, blooming like blood on snow. No one moved. The maid stared, eyes wide. Clara looked down at her hands. A small cut had opened across her palm, a single bead of blood mixing with the spilled wine. She gasped softly, watching the stains spread. Eleanor remained seated, her gaze calm, unflinching. The red stain crept closer to her side of the table, curling around the silverware like an advancing tide. Clara's breathing grew ragged. "You think this makes you better than me?" she said, her voice breaking. Eleanor shook her head. "Better? No." Her eyes drifted to the spreading stain. "Just clean." The words sank into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. The maids glanced at one another, unsure whether to approach. The smell of wine filled the room, sweet and suffocating. Clara pressed her wounded hand against the table, trying to steady herself. The red from her palm left a mark beside her plate. It looked like a signature she couldn't erase. Eleanor's gaze lingered there, then lifted back to Clara. "You see it, don't you?" she said quietly. "It won't wash off." Clara didn't reply. Her throat tightened. She looked down again, watching the red sink deeper into the fibers of the white cloth. The sunlight struck the wine, turning the stain a violent scarlet. It glowed like something alive. The chandelier's crystals above caught that light and scattered it across the walls, tiny flecks of red and white, beauty born from a mess that could never be cleaned. The clock on the far wall began to strike one. Each chime seemed slower than the last. Eleanor exhaled, her face composed, her hand resting gently on the edge of the table. The echo of the final chime rolled through the room and faded. No one spoke again. The room smelled of iron and silence. In that stillness, the red stain kept spreading, bright under the sunlight, refusing to fade. And somewhere beneath that gleam, the house itself seemed to remember the shape of guilt. The light had shifted by late afternoon. It entered the upper hallway of Hale Manor through narrow windows, slanting in thin blades that cut across the walls. Dust floated through the golden air, weightless, slow, like time that refused to pass. Clara Voss walked through that light with uneven steps, her heels clicking out of rhythm, the hem of her red dress still stained dark where wine had spilled. Her reflection appeared and disappeared in each glass panel she passed, fractured by the changing angles of light. Her hand trembled as she touched the wall. The wood was cool, smooth beneath her fingers. Each step forward felt heavier, her chest rising and falling in uneven pulls. She reached the top of the stairs and paused. The hallway stretched long and quiet, a tunnel of mirrors and muted paintings. Somewhere below, the faint clatter of dishes signaled the end of lunch. But up here, the world had narrowed to her and the echo of her own breathing. She opened the door to her room. The air inside was still scented faintly with rose perfume and smoke from an earlier candle. A full-length mirror stood opposite the window, tall and merciless. The light from outside fell directly across it, catching her figure the moment she entered. She froze. Her reflection was not what she expected. Her hair, once smooth and perfect, clung damp to her temples. The red lipstick she had applied that morning had faded into uneven smudges. The wine on her dress had dried into stiff, dark patches. Her eyes were swollen, rimmed in black mascara that had bled into her skin. She looked not like a woman in control, but like a portrait painted after the fire. Clara exhaled, slow and shaky. She moved closer to the mirror, tilting her head slightly. "You're fine," she whispered. The words sounded hollow in the quiet room. "You're fine." "You Baloo." She tried to smooth her hair, pressing down loose strands, straightening her posture. The act only made her reflection worse, too deliberate, too desperate. The glass caught the trembling of her fingers. The afternoon light was unkind. It exposed every imperfection she had tried to hide. She reached for the vanity and switched on the lamp. A harsh white light flooded the mirror, washing out her face. The combined glare of daylight and electricity made the room almost unbearable. The air seemed thinner, hotter. She blinked rapidly, her throat tightening. For a moment she turned away, but the mirror drew her back like gravity. Her eyes met their own again. The longer she stared, the less the face looked familiar. The woman in the reflection stared back with a faint sneer, a coldness Clara hadn't realized she owned. Her breath caught. She stepped closer. "Stop looking at me that way." The reflection did not move. Her hands clenched at her sides. "Stop it!" Still nothing. The tension broke. Clara slammed her palm against the table beside her. The sound startled even her. Bottles rattled. A brush rolled off the edge. Her voice rose before she could stop it. "I'm not the villain." The words burst out, raw and uneven. They echoed once, then faded into the walls. The mirror quivered slightly from the impact. In its surface, she saw two of herself. The defiant one, jaw tight and eyes burning, and the broken one, shoulders sagging under invisible weight. For a second, she didn't know which one was real. Tears welled up, sliding down her cheeks, carving dark paths through her makeup. She laughed suddenly, the sound sharp and empty, and wiped her face with the back of her hand. The streak it left was worse. "Look what you did," she whispered to her reflection. "Look at you." Her eyes blurred. She reached for the perfume bottle on the vanity. the same one Charles had once given her, its glass-tinted amber. She lifted it as if to spray, then stopped. Her grip tightened. With a cry, she hurled it toward the mirror. The bottle struck and shattered. The glass cracked from center to edge in a starburst pattern. 100 fractured faces looked back at her. She stepped back, panting. The scent of perfume filled the air, sweet and choking. A droplet of blood ran down her wrist where a shard had grazed her skin. It mixed with the floral fragrance until both smelled like memory and regret. In one of the larger shards near the floor, she saw something gleam. It was a photograph that had fallen from her open purse during the outburst. She knelt slowly, picking it up. It was an old picture. She and Charles Hale at a gala. He was smiling, arm around her waist, his ring glinting under chandelier light. Behind them, blurred but unmistakable, sat Eleanor in a pale dress at another table, her hands folded, her eyes watching them both. Clara's fingers tightened around the photograph. The edges bent slightly under the pressure. The memory rose with painful clarity, Charles whispering, laughing, promising. The charm that once felt like love now echoed as manipulation. She whispered to the empty room. "He never looked at me that way." The admission left her trembling. The room around her seemed to pulse with the words. Her gaze returned to the mirror, now split into shards that reflected her from every direction. Every fragment held a different angle of her face, one crying, one angry, one hollow. The afternoon light slipped lower, striking the broken mirror and scattering it across the walls. Each piece caught fire with color, gold and orange and blood red. The room glowed like a confession burning from within. Then came the sound, a soft knock on the door. 3 gentle taps, patient but firm. Clara froze. The blood on her wrist had begun to dry. Her reflection, multiplied in the broken mirror, all turned toward the door with her. Another knock, softer this time. She turned halfway, her breath uneven. Through the thin crack beneath the door, light spilled in from the hallway, a narrow beam that cut across the floor and climbed up the wall. Eleanor stood outside, though Clara could not yet see her face. Only the shadow of her feet broke the golden line of light. Clara did not answer. Her throat tightened. The air smelled of perfume, dust, and the faint trace of fear. The light from the hallway caught the mirror again, bouncing across every broken piece until it covered Clara entirely. Her reflection multiplied into hundreds of faces staring back. She took a step closer, unable to tell which version of herself was real anymore. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The knocking stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. The last beam of sunlight crossed the window and landed directly on the largest shard of glass at her feet. In it, Clara's reflection stared back, pale and splintered, eyes wide with something close to recognition. The line of light from the door trembled once, then stilled. And in that motionless air, surrounded by fragments of herself, Clara finally saw what guilt looked like. The scent of smoke still lingered in the hallway when Eleanor opened the door. Afternoon light flooded in behind her, stretching long golden lines across the floor. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and the sharp tang of broken glass. Clara Voss sat on the floor beside the shattered mirror, her dress torn, her breath uneven. She looked up, her eyes swollen from crying. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of the wind sneaking through the half-open window. Dust and light danced together, glinting on every fragment of glass scattered across the carpet. The scene felt like the aftermath of a storm that had torn through something fragile. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. Her face was calm, but her pulse beat visibly at her throat. She took a step inside. The wood creaked softly beneath her shoe. Clara's lips parted. Her voice came out hoarse, like someone who had screamed for too long. "He promised everything," she said, "and then he left me nothing." Eleanor did not answer. She moved closer, her gaze sweeping the room. The cracked perfume bottle lay overturned, the amber liquid soaking into the rug. The mirror, once smooth, now reflected the room in jagged pieces. She said quietly, "He left you what you built with him, ashes." Clara let out a hollow laugh. "You think you're pure. You think the court made you holy." Eleanor stopped a few feet away. The sunlight framed her in gold. "No, the court only named what he destroyed." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Clara pressed her hands to her ears as if to block them out. Her fingers left streaks of red where a small cut had reopened. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You don't know what it's like to be chosen and then forgotten. To be told you're everything and then realize you're just convenient." Her laughter cracked mid-sentence. "He said I was different." Eleanor's voice was steady. "He said that to everyone he needed to believe him." Clara shook her head violently. "Stop saying his name like you know him better." "I knew what he feared," Eleanor replied. "That's all anyone ever needs to know about a man." The room grew still again. Light moved across the floor, climbing toward the broken mirror. Outside, a single bird called once and then went silent. Clara stood abruptly, unsteady but defiant. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving dark smudges along her cheek. "You think you've won?" she said, voice rising. "You think truth makes you strong?" Eleanor watched her carefully. "Truth doesn't make anyone strong. It only removes excuses." Something inside, Clara snapped. She turned toward the vanity, where a small silver lighter lay beside the perfume tray. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. "Maybe I can burn this all away," she whispered. Eleanor's stomach tightened. "Clara, don't." But Clara was already flicking the wheel. A small flame appeared, trembling but alive. Its orange glow danced against her tear-streaked face. "If it all burns," she said, "maybe I can start over." The lighter's flame brushed the corner of a folded paper on the desk, the last of the court documents Eleanor had left behind earlier. The edge curled, blackened, then caught. Fire bloomed small and hungry, spreading to the lace runner beneath it. "Stop!" Eleanor said sharply. She crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling a towel from the vanity chair. She smothered the flame, pressing hard until the smoke rose in thin gray ribbons. The smell of scorched paper filled the air. Clara stumbled backward, eyes wide, chest heaving. "Let it burn!" she shouted. "It's all lies!" Eleanor turned toward her, anger flashing for the first time. "It's evidence," she said, "and evidence doesn't care about your feelings." The last of the flame went out. Only smoke remained, curling upward in fragile threads. The sunlight caught it, turning it silver. Eleanor straightened, her breath heavy. Her palms were streaked with soot. Clara sank to her knees, coughing. Her voice came small now. "You think this is about justice," she said. "But it's revenge, isn't it? You want me to suffer." Eleanor shook her head. Suffering was never mine to give. It followed its owner here. The answer made Clara go still. Her eyes darted toward the window. The sky outside had deepened to amber. Shadows reached long across the floor. The mirror shards glowed faintly, reflecting both women in distorted shapes. Eleanor bent down, picking up the half-burned page. The words on it were still visible, though smudged. She folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "You can't unwrite the truth," she said. Clara's shoulders shook. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He made me this way." Eleanor's tone softened, but not her gaze. "Then unmake yourself." The words struck deeper than anger. Clara's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to the lighter still in Eleanor's hand. Eleanor walked to the desk and placed the lighter on its surface. The gesture was calm, deliberate, as if returning a weapon to its sheath. She stepped back, looking toward the window. The light outside was fading into the last fire of the day. Smoke still lingered in the air, drifting lazily toward the open glass. The room smelled of burned perfume and paper, a strange sweetness over something bitter. Clara looked around the room. The mirror's broken edges reflected her from every angle, each fragment catching the glow of sunset. Her own image looked ghostly, 1,000 faces staring back with the same exhaustion. Eleanor stood quietly, her breathing even now. The light on her face softened, outlining her profile in pale gold. The tension between them had shifted, less anger, more recognition of what could no longer be undone. Outside, the wind changed direction. It slipped through the open window and swept across the desk, lifting tiny curls of ash into the air. The ashes drifted upward, turning in slow circles before dissolving into the fading light. Clara watched them. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The movement of the ashes mesmerized her. They looked almost peaceful. Eleanor followed her gaze. "Not every fire destroys," she said softly. "Some exist only to reveal what's left." Neither woman moved for a long time. The sun slid lower, throwing one last beam of gold across the floor. It touched the lighter where it rested on the desk, making the metal gleam faintly. Eleanor glanced at it, then turned away. "The next time fire comes," she murmured, "it won't ask permission." Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the lighter, her expression unreadable. The golden light flickered once across her face and faded. The ashes settled. The smoke thinned. The room fell still again, caught between ruin and calm. In that fragile silence, the light of evening pressed through the window, spreading across the floor like a promise and a warning both. The morning sun rose pale and sharp, painting the glass walls of Hale Manor with a cold brilliance. The air smelled of metal and disinfectant, as if even the house had sensed that this was the day of reckoning. Servants moved silently through the halls, polishing silver, arranging chairs, setting out water glasses on the table in the main salon. No one spoke louder than a whisper. Margaret sat near the window, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her eyes followed the dust motes dancing in the early light. She did not speak, only kept her rosary between her fingers, the beads slipping slowly one by one. The faint rhythm of prayer steadied her trembling hands. At the center of the room stood Eleanor. She wore a light gray dress, simple but dignified, the kind that made silence itself feel heavier. In her hand she held a small hard drive. It looked unremarkable, almost weightless, yet it carried the truth that would destroy or save what was left of this house. On the table beside her lay several folders, each labeled in neat handwriting: financial misuse, domestic assault, private recordings. Across the room, a young journalist checked his equipment. "Mrs. Hale," he said carefully, "the cameras are ready whenever you are." Eleanor nodded once. "We begin when she arrives." He turned back to his work, the metallic clicks of his camera echoing softly. From the far hallway came the sound of footsteps, high heels striking marble in perfect rhythm. Clara entered the salon, wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks. She had painted her face, but the foundation could not hide the shadows under her eyes. Her hair was neatly tied, every strand in place, as if she could still control something in this house. Eleanor didn't move. The air between them thickened. "You sent for me," Clara said flatly. "I did," Eleanor replied. "You still live here. You deserve to hear what the house remembers." Clara gave a small, tense laugh. "You're turning this into theater. Justice doesn't belong to you." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "It belongs to the truth." The words landed like a pebble dropped into still water. Ripples of silence spread through the room. Eleanor turned to the journalist. "Play the recording." The man pressed a button. The screen on the far wall flickered to life, its blue glow cutting through the morning light. For a moment, there was only static. Then came a voice, deep, smooth, unmistakable. "Charles Hale. If she dies," he said calmly, "we take everything. If she lives, we start over elsewhere." The room seemed to shrink. Clara stiffened. "That's not," he didn't mean. Eleanor's voice cut through her stammering. "Anger doesn't invent words. It only reveals them." The recording continued. Charles again. "Her mother's fragile. Keep her quiet. Fear works better than money." A gasp escaped from one of the servants. Margaret closed her eyes, her rosary slipping from her hand to the floor. The sound of the beads scattering felt louder than thunder. Clara took a step forward, shaking her head. "You don't understand. He was protecting what we built. You twist everything." Eleanor looked at her, unmoved. "You built this on someone else's suffering, and now you're watching it collapse." Clara's composure cracked. "You think you're pure? The court gave you his name, not his love." "I never wanted his love," Eleanor replied. "I only wanted the truth to stop hiding behind it." The recording ended. The screen went black, reflecting their faces in its dark glass, two women bound by the same man's sins. The silence that followed was unbearable. Clara lunged toward the table, snatching for the hard drive. "Turn it off! You have no right to use that." Eleanor caught her wrist mid-motion. Their eyes locked, the air charged with something old and raw. "You wanted his world," Eleanor said softly. "Now you'll live with its ruins." Clara froze, her breath shaking. Then she pulled her hand back, stumbling a step away. The journalist hesitated. "Do you want me to?" "Keep filming," Eleanor said without looking at him. Margaret whispered from the window, "Let it be seen." Eleanor nodded. "Let it be seen." "Ugh!" Clara turned, scanning the room. Every camera, every eye, every sliver of morning light felt like judgment. She backed toward the wall, trembling. "You can't do this to me!" Eleanor's tone remained steady. "The truth is already doing it." Outside, car engines rumbled in the driveway. More journalists had arrived, called by the promise of scandal. The sound of doors slamming echoed faintly through the house. Inside, one of the servants whispered into a phone. "Yes, the press is here. They're recording everything." Clara heard and snapped. "Stop them!" She turned toward the door, but two police officers stepped into the room at that moment. Their uniforms caught the light, bright against the pale walls. "Clara Voss?" one of them said. She froze. "What?" The officer held up a folded document. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud." Her eyes darted toward Eleanor. "You called them?" Eleanor didn't answer. Her silence was heavier than any word could have been. The officers approached, calm but firm. One of them recited her rights while the other produced the handcuffs. Clara shook her head wildly. "No, wait, you don't understand. It wasn't me. It was him." Her words fell flat in the bright air. The cameras kept rolling. Margaret watched, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Mercy," she whispered, though no one could tell for whom. As the metal cuffs clicked around Clara's wrists, the sound was small but final. The light from the window reflected off them, a flash like a mirror. The journalist lowered his camera for a second, then lifted it again. The truth had to be captured. Clara's voice broke into sobs. "Please, I didn't mean—" Eleanor turned away, unable to watch. She stared toward the open door where sunlight poured in, thick and gold. The same light that had once filled the manor during parties and laughter now seemed to purify it. The officers guided Clara toward the entrance. Her footsteps echoed, sharp and uneven, like the ticking of a broken clock. Eleanor stood still until the door shut. Only then did she exhale, long and slow. The room was quiet again. The screens were dark, the cameras still humming softly. Outside, faint sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder as they approached the gates. Margaret bent to pick up her fallen rosary. Her voice trembled as she said, "The house will finally rest." Eleanor looked toward her, then at the empty doorway. The sunlight reached across the floor, touching the edge of her dress. For a long moment, no one moved. The light grew brighter, filling every corner, erasing shadow after shadow. The truth had been spoken, and as the sirens faded into the city air, the house stood silent, bathed in the blinding clarity of morning. The morning outside the federal courthouse was blinding. The marble steps shimmered under the glare of the sun, each one reflecting the swarm of camera flashes that exploded like lightning. Reporters crowded behind metal barriers, their voices tangled in a storm of questions. The air smelled of heat and adrenaline, of anticipation and fear. A black police van stopped at the curb. The back doors opened, and Clara Voss stepped out, wrists bound in silver cuffs. Her eyes darted left and right before the light struck her face. The glare made her flinch. For a second she hesitated, unable to move, until the officer at her side murmured, "This way, ma'am." She walked forward, head bowed, her cream suit wrinkled from the holding cell. The world around her flashed white with cameras, each burst freezing her shame mid-step. Her shoes clicked on the stone, sharp and uneven. Every sound felt magnified in the silence that followed her. Inside the courthouse, the air was colder. The sound of the outside world vanished behind thick doors. The walls rose high, lined with dark wood and columns that smelled faintly of polish. Rows of benches filled with journalists and spectators stretched toward the judge's bench, a sea of faces watching. The hum of whispered speculation died as the bailiff announced the entrance of the judge. "All rise." The sound of movement filled the room. The judge entered, a tall man in a black robe, silver hair shining in the overhead light. He adjusted his glasses, eyes calm but heavy with experience. "This court is now in session," he said. His voice carried through the room, measured and cold. Clara sat at the defense table, her hands trembling in her lap. The cuffs had been removed, but the mark they left around her wrists was red and raw. Her lawyer leaned close, whispering something meant to reassure her. She nodded, though her lips barely moved. Across the aisle sat Eleanor Hale. She wore a navy dress, plain and immaculate. Her posture was straight, her hands folded neatly before her. She didn't look at Clara. Her gaze was fixed on the seal of justice carved into the wooden wall behind the judge. The light from the skylight above fell across her hair like a pale halo. The prosecutor began. His voice was precise, rhythmic, a litany of evidence. He spoke of numbers, accounts, and bank transfers. He named the dates, the false documents, the manipulation of trust. His words sliced through the air, each one deliberate. He turned toward Clara. The defendant conspired with Charles Hale to conceal the illegal transfer of company assets. When Mrs. Hale discovered the fraud, the defendant participated in threats and obstruction to prevent exposure. Clara lifted her head slightly. "That's not true," she whispered. The prosecutor's gaze didn't waver. "The evidence includes a verified recording, financial statements, and written correspondence from your personal email." He gestured to the technician near the monitor. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom dimmed slightly. Charles Hale's voice filled the room, rich and unmistakable. "If she dies, we take everything. If she lives, we start over elsewhere." The air seemed to freeze. Every breath stopped. Then came Clara's voice from the recording, faint but clear. "You're sure no one will find out?" Charles laughed. "Not if you stay quiet." When the clip ended, the silence that followed was unbearable. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Miss Voss, do you dispute the authenticity of this recording?" Clara's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her lawyer spoke instead. "Your Honor, my client was manipulated. She was emotionally coerced, dependent on Mr. Hale's influence. Her participation was not voluntary." The prosecutor responded, calm and cutting. "Dependency does not erase intent. She knew the consequences. She benefited from the fraud." The judge nodded slowly. Noted. His eyes shifted back to Clara. "You may speak if you wish." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Eleanor across the aisle. For the first time their eyes met. The courtroom disappeared around her. All she saw was the quiet woman who had survived everything Clara had helped destroy. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Clara said softly. "He told me he'd leave her. He said we'd have everything." Her voice cracked. "I thought I was finally worth something." Eleanor did not respond. She only lowered her gaze, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor stepped closer. "You thought worth came from him, but worth built on harm is debt, Miss Voss, and debt demands payment." "Oh," Clara covered her face with her hands. "Please," she whispered. The judge exhaled, long and steady. He lifted the document before him. The pages rustled like dry leaves. "This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the circumstances. It finds the defendant guilty on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." A sound rippled through the room, a collective intake of breath. Clara's body went still. "For these crimes," the judge continued, "Clara Voss is sentenced to 20 years in federal custody." The gavel struck once. The sound echoed through the chamber like thunder in a cathedral. Clara gasped. The guards moved forward as her lawyer tried to steady her. Her knees nearly buckled. "Please," she said again, but the word dissolved into silence. The judge closed the file. "May justice bring peace to those it has wounded." The bailiff gestured toward the guards. They took Clara gently but firmly by the arms. She did not resist. Her steps were small, unsteady, her face pale as porcelain. The cameras clicked again, flashes reflecting off her tears. As she reached the door, she turned once, searching for Eleanor. But Eleanor did not look back. She was standing now, hands folded, her expression calm but solemn. She watched the light from the skylight shift across the courtroom floor, bright and unyielding. When the doors closed behind Clara, the sound of her chains faded into the distance. The crowd began to stir again, whispers filling the air like wind through leaves. Eleanor remained still. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she stepped forward, her heels soft against the marble floor, and made her way down the aisle. The sunlight caught the hem of her dress, glinting faintly against the navy fabric. At the entrance, Margaret waited with a white lily in her hands. Her eyes were red, but her smile was gentle. She held out the flower. "It's over," she said quietly, "but peace asks for courage." Eleanor took the lily. The petals were cool against her fingers. "I'll try," she said. Together, they walked down the long corridor. The light from the tall windows bathed the floor in squares of gold and shadow. Each step echoed, slow and certain. At the door, Eleanor paused and looked up. Through the glass ceiling, the sky burned bright blue. The light spilled over her face, washing it clean of all expression. She tightened her grip on the flower. A week had passed since the verdict, but the air around Hale Manor still felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. The afternoon light lay low across the fields, soft and gold, but it could not warm the silence that lived within the walls. The birds no longer nested in the ivy along the windows. Even the wind seemed cautious, brushing through the curtains like a whisper that didn't wish to disturb what remained. Eleanor stood at the window of the main hall. The glass was clean again, but the faint outline of a reporter's palm still lingered from the day the police had come. Outside, the driveway was empty. The black vans were gone, the crowd gone, the noise gone. Only the sound of leaves moving across the gravel broke the quiet. Behind her, the servants moved carefully, restoring order. They spoke in hushed voices, folding tablecloths, polishing the silver, resetting the world that had come undone. None of them looked directly at her. Their fear had changed shape. It was no longer fear of the powerful, but of what truth had left behind. Eleanor turned from the window and walked through the corridor. The wood beneath her shoes creaked like an old memory. The scent of polish and faded perfume filled the air. Every step carried her past ghosts, rooms that had witnessed betrayal, words that had torn through peace. She stopped at the staircase landing, where the sunlight filtered through the stained glass window, scattering colors across the wall. The reds and blues glimmered faintly on her skin. Once, that light had made this house feel alive. Now it felt like the house was learning to breathe again. Her gaze drifted upward, to the second floor. Dust still floated where curtains had been drawn for months. A faint hum of wind passed through the hall, and she followed it up the stairs. The bedroom door opened with a long sigh. The air inside was still. Clara's old perfume hung in the corner, faint but persistent, mixed with the sterile scent of cleaning fluid. The mirror across the room was cracked, its fracture line like a scar. The sunlight hit it at an angle, creating a reflection that was almost kind, 1,000 broken pieces catching the same light. Eleanor walked closer. She looked into the fragments, seeing bits of her own face, fractured and rearranged. In one shard, her eyes seemed younger. In another, older. She placed her hand against the cold glass and whispered, "You don't win by surviving. You win by remaining whole." Her voice didn't echo. It simply disappeared into the silence, absorbed by the house. She turned toward the vanity. A single gold earring lay on the table, forgotten. She picked it up, held it to the light, then placed it into a small box marked "Lost Things." The act felt ceremonial, like burying the last remnant of a fever. When she stepped out of the room, the corridor greeted her with the faint aroma of tea. Margaret was standing at the far end, holding 2 cups on a tray. "Still can't stay away from that room?" her mother asked softly. Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's quieter now, almost peaceful." Margaret nodded, setting the tray down on a small table by the window. They sat across from each other, the silence between them warm this time, not cold. "I used to think justice was the end of everything," Eleanor said. "Like once truth came out, it would wash everything clean." Margaret sipped her tea before answering. "Justice cleans the wound, but it doesn't close it." Eleanor looked at her mother's hands, thin, steady, the skin mapped with years. "Then what closes it?" Margaret smiled gently. "Time, and choosing to remember without bitterness." They sat for a while without speaking. The light shifted slowly, sliding down the walls, softening the sharp edges of the furniture. Outside, the wind picked up, and a branch brushed against the window pane. The sound was gentle, almost like a knock. Eleanor's eyes wandered to the painting on the wall, the one Charles had commissioned years ago. A portrait of the family that never truly existed. She rose, walked toward it, and touched the edge of the frame. The paint was cracked, the colors faded. In the center, his face looked out at her, handsome, confident, and false. She unhooked the frame and set it on the floor. From a drawer nearby, she pulled out a smaller frame. Inside was a photograph, her and Margaret on a spring afternoon long before the scandals, before the trials, before the pain. Both were laughing, the sunlight bright on their faces. She replaced the old portrait with that photograph. For the first time in years, the wall looked lighter. Her mother watched her, saying nothing. Eleanor turned and smiled softly. "It feels right," she said, "to remember what was real." Margaret's eyes glistened. That's all that matters now. Later, Eleanor made her way to the study. The air there was cool and faintly smoky. The desk still bore faint marks where the judge's documents had been signed. A box sat in the corner, sealed and labeled "To be archived, case materials." She sat down, resting her hands on the table, then reached for the last drawer. Inside was a single item left untouched, a photo from the wedding day. The edges were frayed, the glass cracked, but the image was intact. Her younger self, smiling in a gown of white, unaware of the storm that would follow. For a long moment, she looked at that image. Then, carefully, she opened the frame, removed the photo, and cut it in half. The part that held Charles's face fluttered into the wastebasket. The half that remained, hers, and the garden behind her, she slipped into a new frame and placed on the desk. Her breath came easier after that. Outside, the light began to change. The gold of late afternoon deepened into amber. She rose and crossed the room, drawing open the curtains. Dust motes spun in the air like sparks, caught in the warm light. The garden stretched before her, vast and quiet. The grass had begun to grow back where the reporters' trucks once parked. In the far corner, where fire had scorched the hedge, small green shoots were breaking through the soil. Eleanor leaned against the window frame. Her reflection merged with the light, soft and half-transparent. "The house will live again," she whispered. "So will I." Margaret's voice carried faintly from the hall. "Dinner's ready, my dear." "I'll be right there," Eleanor called back. She opened the window. A soft breeze moved through the room, lifting the curtain and carrying the scent of jasmine inside. The sound of children playing drifted from the street below, bright laughter, free and alive. Eleanor smiled. The light touched her face, gentle and forgiving. She turned to the photograph on the desk. The setting sun caught its glass, throwing a beam of gold across the room. For a long moment, she simply watched it, breathing in the quiet. The house no longer felt haunted, it felt awake. And as the light spread wider, painting the walls in the color of peace, Eleanor reached for the window latch and let it open fully. The curtains billowed. The day exhaled. Spring came quietly to Hale Manor. The air was lighter now, filled with the scent of grass and morning dew. The frost that had once sealed the ground melted into a thin mist drifting above the garden. Sunlight shimmered on every surface, touching the marble steps, the windows, the iron gates that had seen too much. For the first time in years, the house breathed without fear. Eleanor stood at the terrace, a porcelain cup in her hands. The tea's steam curled upward, catching the morning light. Her reflection glowed faintly in the window pane. The pale blue of her dress blended with the sky behind her. A robin landed on the railing, tilting its head as if greeting her. She smiled. The simple act of smiling no longer hurt. Inside, voices carried faintly from the main hall. The large table was covered with papers, sketches, and photographs. Volunteers from the city had gathered early, their notebooks open, their faces eager. Eleanor joined them, her steps soft against the marble. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her tone was calm, but there was warmth in it now. Not the careful composure of survival, but the confidence of purpose. They discussed the opening of the Hope Foundation for Women and Children. There would be counseling rooms, legal aid, medical services, and a space for children to play. Every detail mattered. The walls would be painted white and gold, colors of peace and renewal. A young woman in a gray sweater raised her hand. "Do you really believe people can change, Mrs. Hale?" Eleanor paused. She looked out the tall window beside her. The morning light cut across her face, tracing the quiet lines of experience. "I don't believe people can erase their past," she said slowly, "but I believe they can use it to build something better. Justice stops the harm. Compassion prevents it from starting again." The woman nodded, eyes wet. Around the table, there was silence. Not the old kind of silence, but one that carried listening, not fear. After the meeting, Eleanor lingered in the hall. The house no longer felt like a monument to sorrow. It felt alive again, like a heart relearning its rhythm. She touched the wooden railing of the staircase. The polish had faded in spots, but the texture was familiar. It grounded her. She walked to the study where sunlight pooled on the desk. Stacks of old documents waited in boxes labeled Archive. She sat down and opened one. Inside were court files, photographs, her testimony, and at the very bottom, a letter written in Charles's handwriting. She read only the first line before closing it again. Her hands trembled. but not from fear. She placed the letter back and whispered, "Even broken things can reflect light." Her pen moved slowly across a page as she wrote the final paragraph of her speech for the ceremony. The words came naturally, flowing from a place that no longer needed to prove anything. When she stepped outside, the garden was bathed in sunlight. The lawn had been trimmed, the hedges shaped into clean lines. Rows of white lilies and pale blue hydrangeas lined the path. Banners fluttered in the breeze, each carrying the same message: Hope Foundation, founded in memory of those who could not speak. Guests began to arrive: neighbors, journalists, survivors, and volunteers. Laughter mingled with the hum of conversation. Cameras clicked softly. The mayor greeted Eleanor and stepped aside so she could take her place near the ribbon. Margaret stood nearby, graceful in her light gray suit. She held her daughter's hand for a brief moment, her eyes proud but tender. "It's time," she whispered. Eleanor nodded. The murmur of the crowd softened. She walked to the microphone, the ribbon shining in front of her like a thin line between past and future. "This house once witnessed silence," she began. Her voice carried clearly, steady as the breeze. "It saw pain, cruelty, and the kind of fear that makes people forget who they are. But today, it opens its doors to voices that must be heard. To women who were told they had no choice. To children who deserve safety, not scars. To every heart that has forgotten its worth." The crowd listened without moving. Sunlight glimmered in the corners of their eyes. Eleanor continued, "We cannot undo the past, but we can choose what to build on its ashes. Let this place be not a monument to suffering, but a beginning, a promise that no story ends in silence again." Applause rose slowly, then swelled until it filled the air. The sound rolled across the courtyard, echoing off the marble walls. Margaret handed her the scissors. Eleanor took a deep breath, then cut through the white ribbon. The silk parted easily, fluttering upward as a gust of wind swept through the garden. White petals lifted into the air, dancing in the sunlight like small, weightless spirits. Children in the crowd laughed and reached for the petals as they fell. The sound of their laughter carried across the lawn, light and pure. For a moment, Eleanor closed her eyes. She could still hear echoes of the house's past, the arguments, the crying, the silence, but they no longer had power. They were only memories now, fading into the distance. When she opened her eyes, she saw the volunteers leading guests inside, showing them the newly painted rooms. She saw nurses setting up the medical wing, lawyers arranging pamphlets, and a group of children drawing on the patio. Margaret joined her again, slipping her hand through Eleanor's arm. "Hearts heal slower than buildings," she said softly. "But they do heal." Eleanor turned toward her, smiling gently. "As long as light keeps finding the cracks." They stood together watching the crowd. The sunlight shifted through the branches, scattering gold and white over the grass. In the far corner, a camera crew packed up quietly. No one chased headlines anymore. Eleanor stepped onto the stone path lined with lilies. Each step felt lighter. The air was filled with the hum of life, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of voices, the laughter of children. She breathed it in as though it were music. The house behind her gleamed, its windows open wide. Curtains moved gently with the wind, like the slow rhythm of a long exhale. As she reached the end of the path, a little girl handed her a white flower. Eleanor bent down, smiled, and accepted it. The petals were soft against her palm, cool as a promise. She looked up. The sky was impossibly clear. The laughter continued. The world had learned from its pain, and in that learning, it was reborn. The morning broke clear and golden, spilling light through the tall windows of Hale Manor. The world outside shimmered with dew. Every blade of grass gleamed like glass beneath the rising Sunday. The garden, once marked by neglect, was alive again. Birds fluttered between the hydrangeas. The air smelled of earth, tea, and rain remembered. Eleanor woke early. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the wind through the curtains. She slipped from bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked barefoot through the hallway. The floor, once cold and unwelcoming, was warm beneath her feet. The morning light followed her, brushing against the pale blue fabric of her dress. When she reached the window at the landing, she stopped. The sun was rising behind the garden wall, and its first rays spilled into the house. She stood still, eyes half closed, and let the light touch her face. It was the same light that had once exposed every crack in her life, yet today it felt like a blessing. Downstairs, Margaret was already awake, arranging fresh flowers in a vase. She looked up as Eleanor entered the room and smiled softly. "Good morning, my dear," she said. "You didn't sleep much." "I didn't need to," Eleanor replied. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Some nights, peace feels like rest enough." Ugh. They shared breakfast near the window where the sunlight made everything seem brighter. The house no longer carried echoes of shouting or silence. It had learned to hold laughter again, though softly, like something sacred. Later that morning, Eleanor returned to her study. Papers covered the desk, letters, photographs, and the draft of her memoir. The title page bore the name, "The House That Chose the Light." She reread the first paragraph, then set down her pen. Her gaze wandered to a photograph on the wall. It showed a group of women outside the Hope Foundation building, smiling with their children. The picture glowed in the morning light, full of life. Margaret entered quietly with a cup of tea. "Still writing?" "Finishing," Eleanor answered. "I just want to make sure the last words feel true." "What are they?" Margaret asked. Eleanor smiled faintly. "That justice is not an ending. It's the beginning of everything worth remembering." "Oh." Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then it's perfect." They shared a long silence, the kind that feels like understanding rather than absence. As noon approached, Eleanor changed into a simple white dress. She carried a bouquet of white lilies, tied with a thin silver ribbon. Margaret followed her to the garden, the sunlight catching the silver strands in her hair. The air was warm, filled with the hum of bees and the distant laughter of children playing near the foundation's courtyard beyond the gate. They walked slowly toward the staircase at the front of the manor, the same place where everything had once fallen apart. The marble steps glowed faintly in the sunday. The fifth step was chipped at the corner, still showing the faint mark where a suitcase had once struck it. Eleanor paused before it, her hand tightening around the bouquet. She knelt gracefully, her shadow folding beside her. "This was where it began," she whispered, "and where it ends." Margaret stood behind her, silent. Eleanor laid the flowers on the fifth step, arranging them carefully so they wouldn't roll away. The white petals glistened with dew, bright as snow. A soft breeze stirred the ribbons, making them flutter like a heartbeat. "For every woman who thought silence was survival," Eleanor said softly, "for every voice that trembled before it could rise." The air seemed to still. The birds paused in their song. The world listened. Margaret came closer and knelt beside her. Her voice trembled slightly. "You did what I couldn't. You faced the storm and still learned to love the rain." Eleanor turned to her mother. There was no sorrow in her eyes now, only warmth. "You gave me the courage to stand when I couldn't see the light. I only learned to follow it." "Yeah." They sat together for a while, watching the lilies move gently in the wind. The marble gleamed around them, reflecting the morning sun like a mirror. From beyond the garden, the faint sound of children's laughter floated toward them. Eleanor smiled. "Listen," she said. "That's what hope sounds like." Margaret's eyes shone with quiet pride. "You've given them a future," she whispered. "No," Eleanor said softly. "They've given me one." She stood, brushing the dust from her hands. The breeze carried the scent of lilies and sunlight. Above them, the flag of the Hope Foundation fluttered against the blue sky, its white dove emblem catching the wind. Eleanor looked toward the horizon, where the light of the rising sun spilled over the rooftops and into the streets beyond. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the polished glass of the manor door. For a moment, she saw herself as she had once been, fragile, lost, waiting for someone to save her. Then the reflection shifted. She saw the woman she had become, strong, whole, awake. She reached for the handle and opened the great front doors. The hinges moved smoothly, no longer groaning with rust or resistance. Sunlight flooded the foyer, spilling across the marble floor in a wide golden path. She stepped aside so the light could enter fully. The air shimmered, filling the house with a quiet radiance. Dust motes drifted like small stars. Margaret watched from the staircase. "The house looks alive again," she said. Eleanor smiled. "It's finally breathing with the world." They stood in silence as the sun continued to rise, its warmth spreading across the room. The sound of distant bells chimed from the town beyond the hill. Eleanor took one last look at the lilies on the fifth step. The petals trembled in the breeze but did not fall apart. They held their shape, strong and luminous, she whispered, almost to herself. Justice was never about revenge. It was about remembering, and remembering is how love survives. The wind moved gently through the open doors. Curtains lifted like sails, and light poured through every corridor of Hale Manor. The house, once a place of silence, now glowed with the hum of life. Eleanor stepped back into the sunlight, her figure framed by the open doorway. The world before her shimmered in gold. The day had begun.